Hello and welcome to Fat Kid Fit Bod. I'm your friendly neighborhood trainer, Noah Sage Zimmerman. I'm a professional personal trainer based in Los Angeles, California, and I help men and women build bodies that look and feel strong. This podcast will focus not just on physical health, but also mental health and the challenges that make it hard to prioritize your health. I'm here to tell you how you can eat delicious meals, travel, work, build strong relationships, be social, and live the life you want, all while building and maintaining a body you love. With the help of other professionals and people that prioritize health, I'm giving away my best practices and reviewing emerging research in health and fitness so you can feel your best, look your best, and live life to the fullest. All right, welcome back to Fat Kid Fit Bod, Season 3, Episode 1. Today's guest is Dave McBride. He's a doctoral candidate in the chemical engineering program at UC San Diego. He received his BS in chemical engineering from UC Santa Barbara. As a chemical engineer, Dave is interested in improving human health by understanding cells as reactors that integrate biochemical signals and output a complex network of chemical reactions. Dave's graduate work has focused on developing biomaterials to understand and control aberrant immune responses in autoimmune diseases. He hopes that his work will lay the foundation for new treatment options for patients with unmet needs. Outside of research, Dave is an avid beach volleyball player and obsessed dog dad to his dog Hoodoo. Please, everyone, welcome Dave McBride. We do have a live audio, live audience. Everyone, quiet down, quiet down. Welcome, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Noah?
I'm good, man. So just so you guys know a little background, I went to high school with Dave. We were actually just talking about this before the podcast. I know him as Davey. So he's fully embraced his man status as Dave.
Yeah. It was an odd transition for me, but now when I hear Davey, I'm like, oh, that takes me back. But still love the nickname. So feel free to call me whatever.
So Dave was a great athlete, incredibly intelligent guy. So I think before we get into his research and what he's doing now, I'd really like to hear more about your health journey. Right before we were talking about some of the things you've struggled with over the past couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. So I consider myself to be a generally active and fit person. And then about 3 years ago, I had what's called a transient ischemic attack, which is basically a mini stroke. So there was a small clot that went from my heart to my brain, and I had a couple minutes, maybe 10 to 15 minutes of what's called aphasia, where I couldn't understand speech for about a 10-minute period, and then I wasn't able to actually communicate appropriately for another 5 minutes. And it was kind of like it's not like you can't understand anything. It's more like you're listening to a language where you've taken 1 year of high school class and you can pick out the words, but the sentence itself doesn't actually have a meaning to you. And then subsequently, I was able to say words, but the words that came out of my mouth weren't actually what I was trying to say. It was almost like it was all scrambled. And I remember thinking, this is a house episode, and I'm going to be that guy who's stuck in his head for the rest of my life. Like because I was thinking totally normally. I could think perfectly fine, but I couldn't communicate.
Just wasn't clicking.
No. Luckily, it passed, hence transient in the transient ischemic attack. I went to the ER. They looked at me and they were like, you didn't have a stroke. I vaguely knew the symptoms of a stroke because I was actually at my girlfriend's parents' house, and her mom is a nurse. And then my dad had a stroke before I was born. So I knew the symptoms, and it had always been in my mind that it was a possibility. But I had never really thought it was going to happen, and then it happened. And I said, oh, I know what this is. Went to the hospital. They said, you didn't have this thing. And they were going to send me home, and they called neurology, and neurology was like, keep him overnight, and we're going to do an MRI and an EEG in the morning. He might have had a seizure. But They got me in the MRI machine. Yeah. So, and it was during the height of COVID. Ooh. So I was sleeping in a trolley in the hallway because it was just packed. I mean, they didn't have any beds. And so they took me for the MRI, and on the MRI, they said, oh, yeah, we can see the little piece of your brain that died, essentially. And it's, it's infinitesimal. Your brain's able to reroute around it because it's such a phenomenally plastic organ. But they said, yeah, you had a stroke. And so then ran a battery of tests, ended up tracing it to so it was essentially what's called a cryptogenic stroke, where there's no specific traceable cause, but I had something called a patent foramen ovale, which is, or PFO, which is a little perforation between your atriums in your heart. And basically, what can happen is little clots form all the time, but usually they go through your lungs, they get busted up. Because there's this little hole, a clot can slip through, and rather than going to the lungs, it actually goes straight through and then goes up to the brain.
Oh, jeez.
And so they think that's what caused it. So I ended up having surgery to fix that. I also had a growth on my aortic valve, which is associated with strokes as well. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to just get the catheterized procedure, which they can do to close the little thing, which is like you're up and running in a week. They had to chop me a little bit, and
Do you still have an
luckily,
scar?
oh yeah, I have a scar that runs pretty much the whole length of my sternum.
Jeez.
And I can feel like when they put your sternum back together, they can't cast it, but you
Yeah.
need the bone to stay in place. So they wrap a bunch of wires around it, and where the wires cross, there's little brackets. And so, I can feel the brackets underneath
Wild.
my skin. And when I get, every once in a while, I'll make a chest dig in volleyball when the volleyball hits me really hard, and I'll get little bruises in these X patterns along my sternum.
Jeez. So how long was it you were in the hospital till you were able to get back to being Dave?
So from the hospital, I was pretty much back immediately. But then there was a 6-month period where we were kind of deciding what to do. So they found this congenital defect, and it was, do we repair it, or do you just go on living your life on blood thinners? And we ultimately decided that basically the accumulated risk over the entirety of my life of being on blood thinners, where if I get into an accident, I could bleed out, basically. Yeah. Like there was a much higher risk, we decided, of being on blood thinners for ideally, the next 60 years, hopefully, than there was from getting heart surgery, which, sure, it sounds scary, but the recovery, not too bad. It's basically just a broken bone. Your heart is also an incredible organ, able to heal very well. So we kind of took 6 months to make that decision, and then I had the surgery. And then after the surgery, it was 12 weeks, maybe 3 months, and I was pretty much back at full tilt after that.
So, yeah. It's an incredible thing to go through. And we were just talking about how hard life is and just the ability for the body and brain to overcome things.
Yeah.
And how resilient, the brain and the heart are. But, I want to hear really about your research in autoimmune diseases, because there's certain people that are born or develop these conditions that their bodies are fighting against it and not helping to support them. So I'd really love to hear more about how you got into studying rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah, so like you said, my research focuses on autoimmune disease and making what are essentially non-immunosuppressive treatments for autoimmune disease. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute and why that's important. But basically, the way that I got into researching this was I did a chemical engineering undergraduate, and nowadays about half of chemical engineering research at the graduate level is looking at biological systems, because chemical engineering is all about understanding signaling complexes and how do you treat these things like reactors, and cells you can treat very similar to chemical reactors. And so I found this area of application of my chemical engineering background to be really interesting. I think human health is really interesting. It's a super complex system. And originally, to me, it was just an interesting problem. But after the first year, where I was generally learning biology because I had pretty much no biology background, I ended up getting a grant from a rheumatoid arthritis to research rheumatoid arthritis, and really got to start interfacing with clinicians and patients a lot more. And it became much more important to me after that, because after seeing the actual struggles that people have with it, it went from being an academic problem to a much more personal and I think important problem to me. Yeah, and in terms of the way that I view it, and from my background, the immune system is this really important system in your body. Like, a lot of times we think about organs when we think about bodies and medical stuff, but the immune system is almost, in a sense, an organ, but it's systemic, and it travels throughout your whole body. So there's all of this very fascinating biology that occurs throughout your entire body due to the way the immune system interacts with everything. And it interacts with literally everything, your nervous system, your heart. So, your spleen is a major immune organ, but pretty much everything in your body is in some way talking with the immune system. And yeah, so
I'm curious, how do current and conventional treatment of rheumatoid arthritis compare to what you're currently studying in the new medication that you're working on?
So current therapies for a lot of autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease, I guess, a point I wanted to make was autoimmune disease and cancer are really almost two sides of the same coin. The immune system is involved in both, but in one case, the immune system isn't quite doing its job well enough, and so you have your own cells that begin to outgrow, and your immune system can't kill them off, these aberrant cells in cancer. Whereas in autoimmunity, it's the opposite. Your immune cells are hyperactivated, and they actually begin to recognize healthy tissue as something to be attacked and destroyed. And in terms of the way that you treat autoimmunity right now is it's like, okay, well, there's these cells that are acting beyond what they're supposed to be doing, but there's this very complex system of how that immune regulation is called breaks down, but we don't really have elegant solutions to restore that immune regulation. So instead what we do is we say, okay, these are the signaling molecules that are really driving inflammation. Let's just put something in your body that's going to block that signaling molecule from functioning and do it everywhere, because we don't have a way to only hit the cells that are causing this immune disease and this autoimmune disease. So they operate based on what's sort of this generalized immune suppression paradigm, where you're shutting down all immune function to some degree to sort of bring that hyperactivated state back to a relatively normal state. But there are dangerous side effects, such as you are immune suppressed, so you're more susceptible to opportunistic infections. And as mentioned, cancer is sort of on that other side of the spectrum where your immune system's not working well enough. So you actually, because you're depressing the immune system, you're making patients more susceptible to cancers. So
yeah, I take an immunosuppressant every day for mild psoriatic colitis. So obviously, I would love I love a medication that doesn't have to suppress my immune system.
Right. So essentially what my research is on is what I think a lot of academic research is on currently is trying to figure out ways to actually restore the checkpoints that have broken down. So the regulatory mechanisms, because your body has evolved to have these really elegant mechanisms to say, oh no, that's healthy tissue, don't go and attack that. And there's these many, many different cell types that orchestrate an immune response. And in my research, I primarily focus on something called a T cell, and it's part of the adaptive immune response. And so generally, the adaptive immune response recognizes things in a disease-specific or in a tissue-specific manner. It recognizes fragments of disease. So like when you get a vaccine against the flu, the reason you have to get a different vaccine against the flu and COVID and something else is because that vaccine has little fragments of the disease that help your immune system recognize it.
Interesting.
Now your immune system, and so what's recognizing that is usually either T cells or B cells. Those are your really two main drivers of your adaptive immune system, and then they can orchestrate a big immune response against that using all of these other cell types. But they're the real master drivers of that immune response initially. Mm-hmm. And in autoimmune disease, what happens a lot of time, the reason that you see a lot of tissue restricted autoimmune diseases, such as type 1 diabetes is your pancreas and your immune system attacking your pancreas. Rheumatoid arthritis is your immune system generally attacking your joints. Multiple sclerosis is your immune system attacking your central nervous system. And the reason that they're tissue restricted is you get a subset of those cells that recognizes some specific, we call it an antigen. It's a disease fragment basically, or a fragment of a cell. And you start to get these uncontrolled reactions where it's, you now have T cells that are recognizing your pancreatic cells and a fragment of them and begin to generate this immune response against your pancreas. And so there's supposed to be cells that help to prevent that from happening that are called regulatory T cells. And so that's a big part of what I study is these regulatory T cells where they can actually, rather than generate an immune response against a specific antigen, they actually suppress the immune response against a specific antigen. And so if you can generate regulatory T cells that are very specific for the joint or very specific for the pancreas or very specific for the gut, now all of a sudden what you have is something that's going to, rather than suppress your entire immune system, it's only going to inhibit immune responses in that specific tissue in response to whatever that specific antigen is.
Fascinating. How close are you guys to human trials?
So we are currently figuring out exactly what the pathway to human trials looks like. What we've ended up doing is we've taken essentially a therapeutic agent that is currently known and FDA approved. And the problem with it is you actually get a lot of systemic toxicities with this agent. It's currently used for treating cancer, but it actually also can promote these regulatory T cells in the proper context over a lot of these disease-causing T cells. So T cells can be disease protective or disease causing in autoimmune diseases. And so we have found this molecule that turns the disease causing ones into disease protective cells.
Fascinating.
But if you just take this drug, one, you'll get that conversion everywhere, which you don't want because then you have regulatory T cells that are going to inhibit. Basically, again, it's just a broad immunosuppressant. And two, there's other toxicities. It doesn't just affect T cells; it affects a bunch of other cell types, and you'll get some systemic toxicities that you don't really want. So we've basically formulated something where it does a prolonged release of this that you can inject into a localized tissue such that it'll promote regulatory T cells in that tissue, and you can inject it only once every 3 months to generate these disease protective regulatory T cells. And it's modifying the cells in a way where it's not like, oh, when the drug's there, they're helpful, and then when the drug is gone, they go back to being inflammatory. It's actually modifying the cells at the DNA level in a way that's going to help these cells retain their regulatory function.
So is the goal that you eventually will not have to use it after multiple different types of multiple different treatments?
That is a hope, but realistically, I think that whatever caused your immune system to break down in the first place likely. So essentially, a lot of these autoimmune diseases have genetic components, and that's something that this won't be necessarily addressing. So whether or not you can only take a couple of these and cure it permanently, I find it unlikely for something like that to be on the immediate horizon, but I think that there are some therapies that are under research right now that will work that way in specific patient subsets, but it's going to take some time to really bring those online. They also might be, a lot of those will be cell therapies, I think, and I think those are generally more going to be prohibitively expensive to some people.
As you were saying, a lot of this stuff can be genetics, and we know that our environment, what we eat, our society that we live in, genetics, multiple different factors play into whether you get cancer or an autoimmune disease. Outside of the genetic side, have you, during your research, come across things that really point towards the development of cancer or an autoimmune disease?
So the active therapeutic ingredient, a lot of the active therapeutic ingredients we study in our lab actually happen to be vitamin derivatives. And it's really interesting to me. We've settled on these, and it wasn't like, oh, we only want to look at vitamin derivatives, so that's what we decided to look at. We screened a bunch of molecules initially for, okay, how do all these different molecules affect the immune system? And we ended up finding that these vitamin derivatives, which when I say a vitamin derivative, it's something where your body takes that vitamin and certain cells will process that vitamin in a certain way and then throw it back out, a couple different chemical modifications so that it becomes functional in a certain way for your body. So vitamin D is a major one, vitamin A is a major one, vitamin C is a major one, and all of these things are incredibly fascinating to me because there's so much literature showing how they both prevent cancer and prevent autoimmunity, which doesn't seem like it should be a thing from like I said, those generally I view those as kind of two sides of a coin, where you're not going to be both preventing cancer and preventing autoimmunity because you're either activating the immune system more or you're suppressing the immune system more. But vitamins in general, these vitamin derivatives, your body is so evolutionarily adapted to use these things in a way that really prevents both of those things. So I think really, to me, that's a big thing, is you want to make sure you're getting your vitamins. And
So it's a lot of the Western diet. A lot of the Western diet is processed foods that are
Yes.
severely lacking in nutrient density. And I mean, even today, like there's research showing that a lot of agriculture these days have like 50% less nutrients than back in the early 1900s. So do you recommend people are always supplementing with vitamins? Because when I work with my nutrition clients, I always really focus on, we call them like the big rocks, like making sure we're focused on movement, lean, nutrient dense foods, sleep, hydration, and then backfill supplementation, micronutrients, minerals. Once we figure out like these big rocks, like looking at the small rocks.
Yeah.
So do you recommend, like, obviously like micronutrients could be considered a big rock, but if people are eating nutrient dense food, they're probably going to be getting a fair amount of vitamins and minerals.
Totally. And I think this is something that we were chatting about a little bit before the podcast, but usually, I think in a general sense, you kind of know what is the most healthy for you. And eating unprocessed whole foods is going to be getting you a lot more of those micronutrients. And so, sure, you want to be hitting your macros, but if you're hitting your macros by eating whole foods as opposed to taking 10 scoops of protein powder, it doesn't mean don't use protein powder, but the more whole foods you can incorporate into your diet, I think that is something that we all know we should be doing, but the more you can do it, it's not just about your macros. It's about all of it. And it's about your whole body being able to do what it needs to do. But in terms of supplementation, I do think that there's definitely a place for supplementation. There's a lot of studies that just show, hey, if you do vitamin D supplementation, your chances of developing an autoimmune disease go down by a massive amount. I believe it's about 30%. And there's a lot of research showing that a majority of people are vitamin D deficient. So yes, I definitely think taking supplements has a reasonable place, because sometimes it's hard. Like we were talking about, life is hard. Sometimes it's hard to go home and cook a whole food meal. And so on the days when you can't do that, I definitely think, making sure that you're supplementing with those vitamins. And even on the days where you can, unless you're really, really pumping your body way too full of vitamins and are like, oh, I'm taking like 10 grams of vitamin D a day, which can be dangerous.
Yes.
But for the most part, your body's very good at processing and spitting out what it doesn't need.
Yeah, you'd really, really have to be trying hard to OD on vitamins. Besides vitamin D, what kind of supplements do you recommend for people, in general, or those of us with autoimmune diseases, or people, going through cancer treatments and etc.?
Yeah. So I will say I'm not an expert in terms of the actual supplementation realm. And so this is all good to be checked with literature. Aside from vitamins, personally, I don't take a whole lot. I think making sure you are getting... So this is one place where maybe actually I should say, rather than vitamins, something that I also think is important is fiber and unprocessed fibers, if you can. I know in some cases it can be detrimental. I think there are certain people with ulcerative colitis where the fiber aspect, if you eat too much fiber, it can actually be really bad. But this is gonna go maybe a little bit into the microbiome stuff, but essentially fiber isn't necessarily a vitamin per se, but what it does is there's so many benefits to how it affects your microbiome, and subsequently how that microbiome processes that fiber, the metabolites that those bacteria create. Essentially, these bacteria have evolved alongside us for centuries, and our body and the bacteria have learned how to communicate to some degree. And a lot of the byproducts of what the bacteria make when you eat fiber is something that actually promotes inflammation resolution, And so there are issues with, I think, in terms of sort of macroscopically, if you have too much fiber, there's an overproduction of certain gases, and it can hit certain spots where basically food almost gets like stuck. But in terms of that, I think that's a place where you want to make sure you're getting enough fiber in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
Other than that, yeah.
I know that there's been multiple. So one of the best ways to get extra fiber is eat vegetables, and there's been a lot of studies that people, and vitamins and mineral or vitamins from plants and get your fiber.
Yeah.
But there's so many studies that show that eating more fiber actually helps make and create healthy bacteria within your gut and your microbiome. So shifting into the microbiome, in your studies, how important, or how am I going to say this? Have you noticed that there's a lot of correlation within the research you've done or the studies and literature that you've read, that there's association between the, whether how healthy or unhealthy your microbiome is and how that associates with metabolic diseases like diabetes or neurological diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, MS, or, gut diseases like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis?
Yeah. I'm going to make one last point about supplementation. Is I think that we were discussing BPC 157 at one point, and I think one of the big things about supplementation and sort of any molecule, really, I mean, this is true for drugs also. We talk about supplements, but this supplements, anything you're putting in your body is a drug, quote unquote. Your body interacts with it in some way, but different people react to different things differently. So you can sort of look at a general prescriptive, like, okay, these have been shown to do this in certain patient populations, but I need to try out whether or not it's going to work for me and do so in a manner that's worked out well with my doctor.
I mean, that's such like a good point, because there's a lot of people that say like, do this and it's going to fix your gut health, or do this and it's going to do this. And it's like,
yeah,
the body, everyone's body is so individual, and what works for someone else isn't going to work for another person. And like, as you were saying earlier, like our bodies are so adaptable, and they're really like incredibly intelligent machines that work in perfect unison with all the different systems in our body.
Yeah.
And they're so unique to each individual.
Yeah. Something I'll say from literature and research that just came out that I really love is we basically do these studies where we map genes to the human genome, and we say, okay, how similar or different is this from the human genome? And something that just was done recently was the creation of what's called a pan genome, where they said, okay, there's not a human genome. People that are ethnically distinct tend to have different what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, so insertions, deletions, where sure, we all you can average the world, but at some point, if you are seeing that there's more of a frequency of a certain disease in a certain population of people, it might be more relevant to start referencing things to an average genome for that patient population or that population of people. And so there's a research group that just created the pan genome, which is basically a bunch of different genomes for different ethnic backgrounds, which I think is a really, really valuable tool.
That's really interesting. So does that kind of go into the realm of epigenetics?
Yes. So I was not expecting to talk about epigenetics at all. When I say that the therapeutic that we're using right now modulates the DNA in a certain way, it makes epigenetic modifications, where essentially what an epigenetic modification is, for listeners who don't necessarily know, is it's basically like the DNA in your eyeball and the DNA in your skin and the DNA in your blood. They're all the same DNA, but how it gets expressed is determined by basically a variety of different markers that are on the DNA that determine what is open, what is available to be read and transcribed. And so you can think of it like they all are the same library, but different sections of the library are blocked off. There's the restricted section, like from Harry Potter in your eyeballs, but that restricted section is open in your skin cells or something. And epigenetic modifications are sort of that openness or closedness of certain regions. And so it really determines how your DNA gets expressed.
And that has everything to do with your genetics and like where you come from, your lineage, your ancestors.
So no. So epigenetics is actually the exact opposite for the most part.
Interesting.
Epigenetics is highly influenced by your environment, what you take in, whereas sort of your baseline genetics, your genome, is what is your background. What X did you get from your dad? What Y did Other way around. What
Mm,
X did you get from your mom? What Y did you get from your dad? What genes did you get from your parents? That's your genome. And then how that gets expressed, that's your epigenome. And
got it.
how it gets expressed is based on these different markers. Most of the markers are formed during development, but then as you get exposed to different things, it can change certain markers. So that's a big thing that we look at. And yeah.
I was reading a study that was talking about how basically every human baby from basically 0 to I think it was like 18 months is the same essentially.
Mhm.
And that's when environmental factors start to play into, how they move, how they, their immune system, how they walk. So like every, coming from like a movement perspective, that you see a baby sit down into a squat and you're like, holy shit, like why can't I sit down into a squat like that? Like that's the perfect range of motion that anyone could be after. And
Yeah,
then, in certain countries where movement is more integrated into their everyday life, they are able to maintain that range of motion. But here in like Western countries where kids start to sit on their phones or play video games, watch TV all day, you on a normal basis see people in Western countries not able to move as well as other countries. So, I would love to hear more about where you see certain environmental, and then we can talk about like even like environmental social justice, where like people in, communities that are closer to factories or things that pollute the air are often more unhealthy
totally.
and develop more autoimmune diseases and etc.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think your environment plays a huge role, and maybe I think I skipped a little bit the microbiome question because I wanted to get in that bit
We
about the
we can
supplement
get
stuff.
back to it.
But okay, but I think that's the reason that I bring it up now is that's a big part of the environment too. Is what is your diet, right? What
Mm.
is you mentioned the Western diet. When I think of the environment is comprised of. I mean, it's many different things. Literally, right now there is a funding announcement by the National Institute of Health that is literally the announcement is essentially just saying, hey, we need a way to quantify what is called the exposome. What are you exposed to? And because we don't have a good way to quantify this thing right now, there's research labs that are doing great research on developing pieces of it, but we need to, it's basically a funding announcement to say we need to get this concerted effort so that we have a good way to quantify what are you exposed to, what is your environment, and how is that
Interesting.
influencing all of these certain health
Mm.
aspects. And so in terms of that motion, I mean, I think the motion aspect is definitely very important. There's a lot of mechanobiology. I'm not an expert in mechanobiology, but basically, long story short, your cells don't just sense chemicals, they also sense whether or not those chemicals are getting pushed or pulled in certain ways. So there's, for example, there's certain molecules where if the molecule is what we would say free, like soluble, just floating
Mhm.
around and it interacts with the receptor, it's not going to do anything. But if that molecule is anchored onto another cell, now all of a sudden it acts like a lever and it goes boing, and then that
Mm.
transduces a signal down into the cell. So, for example, there's a lot of mechanobiology behind bone formation, muscle lengthening, and so that is playing a huge role in how you're developing. And likely, again, I'm not an expert in this aspect of development, but likely it's leaving epigenetic imprints as it does that to sort of allow yourself to develop in a certain way. In terms of the epigenetics and in terms of the environmental exposure, maybe another example I can bring in is that microbiome, where these metabolites that I was mentioning. So, your microbiome is a huge, diverse set of bacteria that colonize various different parts of you. We talk about different microbiomes, right? There's essentially the microbiome, even if you say the skin microbiome, that's like incredibly diverse from where you sample on the skin. So the microbiome in my armpits personally is horrible. My girlfriend is very upset about that all the time. But uh, and so the way that those cells, and when I say cells here, I'm talking about the microbes. The way that those microbes basically eat stuff and then what they poop out, essentially, interacts with your body in a lot of ways. And a lot of our body has evolved so that there's receptors for a lot of those things. And essentially, what those receptors do, many of them, is they then say, oh, I'm being signaled through. I'm going to go make changes to either what are called the histones, which is what your DNA wraps around, or I'm going to make changes to the DNA itself, not necessarily changing an A to a C or a T to a G, but rather they're going to go in and change what are called methylation patterns, where these methylation patterns determine whether or not that DNA is very easily opened so that it can be turned into a protein, because proteins are what do everything in your body. Proteins are like the function, they're the tool. Yeah, exactly. And so what microbiome you have is this very interesting thing, because it's you feed your microbiome. So what microbiome you feed determines what that microbiome poops out, and then what that microbiome poops out determines what epigenetic modifications are made to your cells, and what epigenetic modifications are made to your cells determines what those cells are. So as an environmental aspect, that has many aspects to it. It has what you're putting into your body, but then there's also, like you said, there's the air that's around you, right? You're not feeding your skin, but your skin has a microbiome, so your sun exposure is probably a big part of that. I'm not as much of an expert on the skin, but literally anything that is interacting with it is likely affecting it in some way.
Yeah, for everybody to know, like, our body has billions of bacteria. There can be good bacteria, there can be bad bacteria. So, I'm curious how, in your studies, research that you've done, literature, in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, whether they're in like a really bad flare or have a pretty good spot where they're mostly in remission, is there any literature or anything that you've seen that compares, one person's microbiome that's in a flare or like in a bad way to people that are managing their disease pretty well?
Yeah, so there's definitely major differences in the microbiome depending on several things, including disease state. One actually major predictor of whether or not you are going to develop rheumatoid arthritis is periodontal disease. And you might say, well, how is my tooth, right? Periodontal disease is gum disease, essentially. So how are my teeth associated with my knees or my fingers? And because there's this immune system that traffics throughout your whole body, basically what happens is you have these bacteria on your teeth that produce these molecules that influence the cells there. And there's a couple different aspects to this. So there's both what the bacteria themselves produce as sort of these metabolic byproducts that influence cell epigenetics. But then there's this other aspect, which is emerging more, I would say, in the idea of what's considered molecular mimicry. So one of the ways that these bacteria might have evolved to sort of evade the immune response and not constantly have an immune response against them is by having pieces of themselves that look very similar to us. So those regulatory T cells that I mentioned that can go and recognize a specific, joint cell or a specific type 1 diabetes pancreatic cell, the bacteria has learned to have fragments of itself that look like fragments of your pancreas, kind of thing. And so in a healthy state, it's all great. But then if you get this dysbiosis in your gums and you get this inflammation in your gums, where you get this new bacteria that's in there and is producing bad things, you're having this inflammation, and you're also having these other cells die that look similar to your pancreas cells, your body's saying, oh, I'm learning an immune response against the bacteria in my mouth. And it happens to look very similar to to your healthy joint cells.
Interesting.
So going back to rheumatoid arthritis, with the periodontitis in the mouth, if you get this dysbiosis, you now also are likely generating cells that recognize not just the bacteria in the mouth, but also the cells in your joints, because of this similarity in how they look in terms of their molecular signature. So
brush your teeth and floss.
Yeah, seriously. And if you have chronic inflammation in your gums, definitely talk to your dentist about it, because it can be a predictor of subsequent autoimmune disease, especially rheumatoid arthritis. But I believe there's a couple other ones that are associated with it. And you mentioned multiple sclerosis. There's a lot of, so one of the molecules that I've studied is called butyrate.
Mm-hmm.
It's a byproduct of cellular bacterial metabolism, I should say, of fiber, where it's not something your body digests, but it is something that these bacteria digest. And they're called short chain fatty acids. So there's butyrate, pentanoate, and what they've found is, hey, if you sample the fecal matter of patients with severe multiple sclerosis or who are in remission, you see these massive increases in these short chain fatty acids in the patients that are in remission, because they have this microbiome that's shifted to being more healthy. And so in patients with severe multiple sclerosis, they're actually looking at supplementation with these short chain fatty acids, which are relatively easy to produce, to sort of supplement that function. And they're seeing some, I believe the last time I saw a clinical study on it, the results were definitely promising. I think they might be into phase 2 trials now, but I can't remember exactly.
Is this something like along the lines of like a fecal transplant? Because I know for people that have gut diseases, I know fecal transplants are a great way to kind of reset and help fix the microbiome and alleviate symptoms.
Yeah, so this is essentially maybe downstream of that, whereas a fecal transplant would really be working to address the upstream issue of, okay, you don't have the correct microbiome anymore. And sometimes I think there's a challenge, because even if you switch your diet completely, if it's already too far gone, you don't have the bacteria, I should say. I keep saying cells, I mean bacteria when I'm talking about the microbiome. But you don't have the microbiome, the specific types of bacteria that you need to feed. You don't have them anymore. And so in those cases, a fecal transplant is something that can help sort of recolonize your gut, try to wash out what was in there, refeed this new type. I haven't done as much research on fecal transplants, but I would imagine that what you eat following the fecal transplant is also likely very important, because you want to make sure that, hey, the fecal transplant is there to seed this helpful bacteria, but now you also want to make sure you are feeding that bacteria, because that bacteria only gets to see what you see. And one of the funny things is, most of the bad types of bacteria, the thing that it loves to eat is sugar. Like, sugar is, I feel like we all know sugar is bad for us, but the number of ways in which sugar is bad for us is always staggering to me.
I want to know more about that, because obviously sugar in its essence is a carbohydrate, and carbohydrate is one of the ways that our metabolism and our muscles and body uses energy to maintain all its functions that we need to do to stay alive.
Yeah.
And there are certain aspects of the health and fitness industry. There's people like bodybuilders who will eat like gummy bears or Rice Krispies before workout, because it's going to help provide them energy. They're going to get a sick pump because of all the sugar and carbohydrates in it. And then on the other side, there's people that eat, won't touch sugar. The only sugars they'll eat are fruit, or, people are like, don't eat fruit because it's terrible for you. Where is there a line in your experience, in what you've seen and study, where certain sugars are okay versus certain sugars are not okay?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so again, not necessarily as much of an expert in this, but I feel like fruit is never a bad thing to eat. And one of the reasons of that,
I want to touch a quick point real quick, because this is really funny. You always hear like the carnivore diet is like huge nowadays, and people are like, fruit will kill you. I'm like, show me an unhealthy person. Like, show me someone that eats fruit that's unhealthy. Besides fruitarians, or people that only eat fruit. But in general, yeah.
I think there are valid aspects to certain vegetables are maybe not that designed for human consumption. I think there is a little bit of validity to that, but also, like, no one thing is ever going to kill you, in my opinion. Your body is exquisitely designed. Fruit, though, I mean, fruit is literally designed for you to eat. That is what plants want you to do with it. It's why it tastes so good.
Mm-hmm.
And one really big thing about sugar, I would say, not sugar, well, sugar and fruit, is there's a lot to do with how quickly that sugar releases from the fruit. And so, again, going back to fiber, fruit is really good because not only does it have these good sugars that are also a little bit harder for your body to break down, not massively harder, but a little bit harder for your body to break down, but also it's sequestered in these macroscopic fibrotic tissues. Like when you eat fruit, you're chewing. I always think of nectarines and peaches, and I love the texture of nectarines and peaches because you can feel those fibers, and there's something to me that's super satisfying about chewing on that. And you might think, oh, well, that gets, your stomach acid breaks that all down. It actually doesn't. So that continues to pass through you. So there's these still, even if they're not, huge chunks, there's still these fibrotic pieces, and it takes longer for the sugar to actually diffuse out of that. So rather than getting this huge amount of sugar rush, which is, if you look it up, you can actually look up what the glycemic index of various fruits are. Bananas are actually super high because they're relatively mushy and
soft, yeah,
very sugary. Yeah.
So glycemic index just regards how your body insulin responds to certain foods that you eat.
Right.
Just
and
for the listeners.
In this case, I guess, in this context, for fruit, basically, that insulin response is sort of a surrogate measure for how quickly the sugar is being released from the fruit. And you can find fruits where, sure, it might have a lot of sugar in it, but it's not released very quickly. And I think for anyone who's ever done cell culture and bacteria culture before, I mean, the way you grow cells and the way you grow bacteria is you basically give it sugar. And if
Hello,
you
alcohol.
give it sugar, yeah, the way that it proliferates is wild. And so I think sort of that very processed food where the sugar is being released very quickly and is very readily available, these are going to be able to go wild. Whereas if you're eating fruit and it's, sure, there's sugar in it, but it's being released to them more slowly, you're not just going to be only feeding these bad bacteria that are going to go crazy with the sugar. And I think that's a big part of sort of the sugar danger, I would say. Maybe not danger isn't the right word, but the fact that a lot of the bacteria that want to grow very quickly that are maybe not as good for you can do so when there's an excess of sugar because they are more efficient at using that than the bacteria who are like, oh, I could persist on fiber. And so when you're giving your bacteria sugar a bunch, all of a sudden you have this massive outgrowth of these bacteria types that prefer to use sugar as a source. And then what happens with a lot of those, and one of the reasons you feel uncomfortable, is a lot of those bacteria then die because they've grown a ton. And those toxins can kill off the good bacteria. They're out competing the good bacteria. And two, I mean, if you think about it, bacteria dying inside you, sure, it's happening all the time. But if you have this massive outgrowth and then this massive death, they release a bunch of toxins that are not going to make you feel very good. So I think that's where a lot of that sugar issue comes from, and why fruit on that spectrum, not so bad. If I can personally, like, I love smoothies, but if I can, I try to minimize drinking a smoothie if I can instead eat a piece of fruit. But at the same time, like, it's not, there's definitely levels to it. And I think that glycemic index thing is a good surrogate for how quickly that sugar is being released.
Yeah, and this is kind of a great example that, people have trouble like distinguishing the difference between eating fruit or having a glass of juice. Whereas like the juice has a complete lack of fiber. You're removing all the fleshy bits of fruit, and you're just straight up drinking fructose, like straight to the dome.
Yep. Yeah, and that's exactly that was actually, I mean, you say people have trouble distinguishing. I didn't get the difference between those until I was doing this research and realizing, oh, fiber is so important. Why is fiber so important? Oh, this is why fruit is so much better for you than juice. And like juice is basically like drinking a soda. Sure, it has more of those vitamins, but there's no, I think we talked about the supplementation, and I think some people, it's very easy to say, oh, if I take these supplements, I'm going to feel better. But there's no one aspect of health that's like, this is what's going to fix you. The more you can take a holistic approach to improving your health, the more successful you're going to be. I mean, I think we talked about the mechanobiology. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, like, I think that's one of the frustrating things coming from, someone like you who's trying to help people, and someone like me who's trying to help people, is that people, and I mean, the health industry itself there's so much snake oil. Like, well, supplements are great.
Totally.
A lot of people use supplementation as like, this is going to fix the problem. Whereas the things that actually are going to fix the problem are things, lifestyle. the choices they make, how much
Yes.
they move, their majority of the food that they consume.
Yes. And I think something that's very true also, so you're talking about like the health industry from more of like a fitness and supplementation perspective, but also from a doctor perspective. I've had a lot of chance to work with doctors over the course of my PhD and also over the course of my own medical issues. And one thing that I think is very true is, as a doctor, I think you get tired, and I think you get to the point where you just want to prescribe people something. And I think as a patient, it's very hard to, as a doctor, tell a patient, hey, these are the lifestyle choices you need to make to fix what is ailing you. It doesn't mean that they don't know it, but it means that it's so much easier for them to just say, hey, you need to take a statin for the rest of your life and it's really going to help. It doesn't mean that maybe that will help and maybe that's a part of your what you need to do, but I think doctors get tired, and I think as patients we need to recognize that they're people and do our best to say, okay, I'm going to figure out what I can do to make myself as healthy as possible, and what lifestyle changes are going to help facilitate that.
Totally. And this might be a little bit of a tangent, but and you can correct me if you have had other experiences, but a lot of the people that I know that are doctors, they talk about how they really only have one nutrition course throughout their whole time going through medical school.
Yeah.
And, per this conversation, we're talking about how important it is to fuel your body with the correct nutrients and fuel the microbiome to build healthy bacteria. We could almost argue that this stems back to like an education problem.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yes, I agree. I think there was something that was very funny that I saw some article that was basically some doctor testifying about some nutrition aspect, and the person was questioning him and was like, well, are you an expert on nutrition? And you're a psychologist. And it does what a lot of school trains you to do, and this includes doctor school, medical school, doctor school. Is it trains you how to think, but it doesn't necessarily say where you put your time. And so that's not to say that doctors aren't these people who can know a lot about nutrition, and that person may very well have been a very knowledgeable person about nutrition, but where you end up spending your time studying is very important, because sure, the school can help teach you how to study, but then there's so much literature out there and there's new research being done every day. And it's hard for a single person to keep up on, but I think that's also where, as an individual, where you can really work hard is to find someone that you trust, who it's their job, almost like some sort of personal trainer who doesn't just do personal training but also spends a lot of time keeping up on nutrition literature. I think there's a lot of value in finding that person you trust, and for various aspects of your information.
Totally. And I think this is like such a testament to the holistic health approach. Like, I think the health industry, both in medical or fitness, is like so dogmatic. It's like you can cure all your symptoms and diseases with just fitness and health, or you should only be using pharmaceuticals. Whereas there's a happy medium. Like, I know for my disease management that I have to use pharmaceuticals and work on my lifestyle and what I eat.
Yeah, 100%. And I agree. It's very easy to talk to one person from one side and they say, this is the truth. And you talk to someone from the other side and they say, doctors are killing you, drugs are horrible. Essentially what drugs are is drugs just happen to be very potent molecules that we can put in ourselves that have shown, hey, this molecule doesn't have an effect on 1% of the population, which is sort of, I guess the way that I see it as a supplement is still a molecule you're putting into yourself that causes an effect. A drug is a molecule you're putting into yourself that causes an effect. The difference generally is a drug is something that has been approved by the FDA because it affects pretty much 100% of people this way. Maybe not 100%, but a lot of people this way. Whereas a supplement is something where there's maybe less literature on how many people it's affecting this way. And some supplements have been through clinical trials and had sort of inconsistent results. And it doesn't mean they don't affect anyone. It just means there's likely more of a specific aspect of your biology that goes into how that is going to affect you. And so there's this happy medium of using both. I think, when you really need that drug and you need to know you're going to get this effect, there's very much a place for pharmaceuticals.
I
But
think
yeah.
this is a good transition to start talking about the gut brain axis. And I want to talk also about what you just told me about this before we started recording, is the gut joint axis. So for listeners listening right now, there's the enteric nervous system, which is basically what people call now is like the second brain, which is the system of our GI tract and how our ENS communicates with our central nervous system. And that's why they call it our second brain, because our central nervous system has to do with our brain and our ENS system has to deal with our gut health. So, that's where we talk about like the gastrointestinal nervous system and how important it is, this microbiome, because our gut health can strongly influence our central nervous system.
Yeah. And I guess, did you have a specific aspect of this? Because I could.
That's a good question. So yeah, so like with these neurological diseases or these joint diseases that are heavily influenced based on the multiple different systems in our body, how the gut responds with what causes rheumatoid arthritis, like you were saying, the different bacteria that affect our microbiome, or just the influence that our stomach has on the multiple different systems in our body, whether it's the central nervous system or multiple different systems in our body. I guess my question is, I think it's also important to know that like the gut feeling that people talk about is like how our gut can influence our physiological emotional state and how we
Mhm.
feel and think. So, I'm curious, I know we already talked about how like the microbiome and affects people that have, severe flares with their RA or, have pretty good management of their RA. But I want to hear more about your experience with the gut joint system or gut joint axis
So
that you were talking about.
yeah, so I think maybe from a more broad perspective, everything that you're saying is about the fact that your gut is essentially the main organ system that is involved with taking outside signals and putting them into your body. Like, obviously there's your eyeballs, obviously there's your nose, obviously there's your ears and your skin, which all integrate signals to some degree, but most of those are trying to protect you in some way, whereas your gut is almost saying like, okay, once I put something into my mouth, like, this is going inside me. Right? and and so it's this main axis for something to enter our body and subsequently influence our physiology. And as mentioned, like, we've evolved to really have so many pathways of sensing the things that we're putting into us and to be able to interface with our environment and these things we're putting into us. And so what ends up happening, and the way that I view it, is these molecules that you put into your body, a lot of times we just think of them as, oh, like, if I eat this, I grow muscle. If I eat this, I put on fat. But in reality, what goes into your gut is going into your bloodstream. And what goes into your bloodstream is going throughout your body. And your body has evolved to have so many receptors for these things that aren't just fat or muscle, but also, like you mentioned, a lot of these molecules interface with our brain and interface with our nervous system. And I think there's a big area of research right now about crosstalk between various parts of our body, our nervous system, and our immune system. Because your nervous system and your immune system and your blood are basically the three things that go through everywhere, right? Like, this muscle here on my arm doesn't necessarily connect directly with the muscle on my butt or something, but via the nervous system, signals travel throughout my body to my through my CNS and back out. And similarly, through my immune system, my immune cells are profiling throughout all of those areas, and my blood cells are trafficking throughout many of these areas as well. So essentially, a lot of these molecules don't just influence just our metabolism on like a muscular level, I guess, but also on these molecules, your immune system has ways to interface with them, and your nervous system has ways to interface with them. And so all of that is affecting your function as a human, basically. And in terms of the gut joint axis, for example, your gut actually becomes a big training ground for a variety of different immune cells because it's learning what it should or shouldn't attack sometimes in the gut, because there's this huge amount of foreign material in your gut, right? And so your immune system is encountering such a massive influx of foreign material in the gut that what is going on in your gut, and then those immune cells recirculate. Some of them stay resident. They're what are called resident immune cells, but some do recirculate, and those recirculating cells can go to other places and sort of via some of the pathways I mentioned, where either they just generally have epigenetic changes where they become more inflammatory or less inflammatory, or they have sort of this training of, I'm attacking this type of bacteria because I don't want it in my gut, but actually that type of bacteria kind of looks like my knee, so maybe I should just attack my knee. Right? That there's such a huge amount of foreign material in there that I think our body has really just evolved to sense that through many different systems, including the immune system and the nervous system.
Yeah, I think we've all probably eaten something or drank something and the next day been like, God, why do my joints hurt? Why do my knees hurt?
Yeah.
Why does everything hurt? I mean, like you were saying, like the gut influences the central nervous system, the immune system, and our blood. And, today, I think antibiotics has become, obviously antibiotics is a wonderful tool that we can use to help people that are really sick, but it's also been abused in modern medicine as well. So I'm really curious, how do antibiotics influence the immune system and the prevalence of autoimmune disease orders? Because, I mean, it's hard to know how prevalent autoimmune diseases were back in ancient human times because there's not a lot of study or literature. But I'm curious how more prevalent it is in today's modern times because of antibiotic use.
I want to say one thing about that because I just think this is super cool. There's a study that came out recently that profiled a bunch of bones from the bubonic plague.
Ooh.
And basically what they found is that our immune profile, essentially, your genetics determine what receptors are going to get expressed on these T cells. And basically, it broadly has an influence on whether or not you're going to be susceptible to autoimmune diseases. And they found that the bubonic plague significantly shifted the human population's immune profile and made autoimmune diseases way more prevalent because it basically made it so that the people who survived are the people who had a stronger immune response, and those people who had stronger immune responses and were able to basically kill more of their own tissue in order to ultimately survive the bubonic plague, procreated, passed on their genes. And so the bubonic plague significantly increased our capacity for autoimmune diseases, which I think is super wild.
That is crazy. That blows my mind.
Yeah, because I mean, it killed like a huge percentage of the population back in. Yeah. I totally forgot what the other question was. Sorry.
No, dude, that was amazing.
Antibiotics. Yes. Sorry. That's just
I love that. That's fucking incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes when anthropology and immunology mix, it's one of my favorite things. But in terms of the antibiotics aspect, yeah, I think in a sense there's a lot of this is known but also emerging in terms of exactly how it's going on, because as we've talked about, the diversity of people is so large, and the diversity of microbiomes is so large. And so when you take antibiotics, a lot of times antibiotics generally act through various pathways, and certain bacteria will be more or less susceptible to that. And so what can happen is you can actually end up killing a bunch of good bacteria, or potentially you can just kill all your bacteria. Maybe not all, but you can kill a large portion of them. And what recolonizes following the antibiotics can significantly change essentially your function, because now what metabolites these bacteria are producing, you could have gotten recolonized with a bunch of sort of your bad bacteria. Or when you kill a bunch of bacteria, we've talked about how sugar causes a lot of generally not that great bacteria to proliferate very rapidly. So if you're very bacterially depleted by taking antibiotics, your gut flora is pretty much gone, and there's a lot of space, quote unquote, in the niches that are there for filling. And then you eat a bunch of stuff that's going to cause sort of this not great bacteria to proliferate. It's going to go fill all those niches, and now all of a sudden you basically have a significantly altered microbiome that's producing metabolites that are going to be detrimental to your health. So, I think there's a lot of studies right now that are out there that have shown if you take this antibiotic, you're more susceptible for cancer type A. And it doesn't mean usually when you're taking an antibiotic, I usually should be taking that antibiotic.
Yeah.
But I think one of the big things is a lot of times based on the combination of what our diet is and the fact that we sometimes use broad spectrum antibiotics, it's very easy to be like, oh, I'm going to go eat a diet I'm going to take these broad spectrum antibiotics, kill everything, and then all of a sudden I'm going to have this outgrowth of something that I really don't want to be the major driver in my gut microbiome.
It'd be like taking antibiotics and then go and get a McDonald's meal.
Yeah, so probably after you do antibiotics, make sure to eat healthy. But I don't know how much study there's actually been on that. So, that's my sort of gut feeling of what would be a very important thing. Gut feeling.
Good accent.
But, yeah. But in terms of how much study there's been on that, that's not something that I'm quite as versed in the literature. And then in terms of specific types of antibiotics and enhancing diseases, for example, there's one study that's shown, I can't remember what the two different types of antibiotics were, but it was basically like if you treat mice with tumors with antibiotic type A versus antibiotic type B, both of the antibiotics work really well to kill, essentially, they had tumors, but they also had, some sort of bacterial infection model. And if you use antibiotic type A, it clears out the infection, but the cancer gets way worse. And if you use antibiotic type B, it clears out the infection and the cancer doesn't get way worse, and the cancer continues to it's a model where the cancer would normally resolve spontaneously because of the immune system. So, I think there's a lot of research that's trying to do a better job of, hey, if you are a patient that is susceptible to X, Y, or Z, we are not going to give you antibiotic types A and B, but I don't think the literature is out there yet for that. So it's an area of active research. I think it's going to be important, but what can we do actionably? Likely the biggest thing is you probably just want to eat as healthy as you can for a little while while you're taking and after you take the antibiotics, and honestly probably leading up to taking antibiotics.
Just in general.
Yeah, just in general. But sometimes it's hard. But that's a time where you can really be like, okay, maybe I'm gonna forgo my weekly ice cream or my nightly ice cream for 2 weeks or something. I don't know what the actual numbers are there, but I bet there's literature out there that's beginning to study that.
So I was fascinated when what you were saying about the bubonic plague. Do you have any other examples of the intersection of anthropology and the study of the immune system?
I think broadly that's kind of what I would classify epidemiology as, where it's how do diseases spread, and what behaviors by people cause diseases to spread. But no, it's not an area that I'm particularly well versed in. Let me think for a second if there is anything.
I just put you on the spot.
Yeah,
No worries if you can't think of anything.
Okay, actually, yes, I do have one other example. I just remembered this one. So there's, I want to say it was some sort of Polynesian tribe that does essentially traditional tribal tattoos, and they believe. So what they proved was that essentially, if you do this specific type of tattooing with this bamboo pen, and I think they ended up showing it's generally true for tattooing in general, you get this enhanced immune response. It's almost like a mini vaccine kind of thing, where it just upgrades your immune system slightly, and your immune system is more likely to be able to fight off a various subset of infections.
Fascinating.
And basically, so they showed that likely it helped not just from like a cultural perspective, but it also helped people literally, like these tattoos, the people who would get them would be more likely to survive diseases and more likely to fight off diseases. And so there was sort of a thought of, maybe this practice evolved because, like I'm going to view that person as being like, they're stronger because they have that tattoo, but it's actually they're stronger and more likely to survive because they literally basically had a foreign substance inserted into them, which generated an enhancement in their immune response.
That's fascinating because, I mean, for people that don't have tattoos, a tattoo is essentially just an open wound. You're just like subjecting yourself to getting stabbed over and over and over again multiple times. Whenever I am done getting a tattoo, dude, I am exhausted. I like sweat, and to your point, like, I think my immune system is just like, what the fuck are you doing to me?
Yeah, no, that's exactly, yeah. So
right.
I don't know. I thought that was a really interesting other
intersection. It's good to know that not only am I getting more tattoos for art, but it's also going to help me be healthier and fight off diseases.
Well, potentially though, but if you also have UC, maybe it's not good.
yeah. I wanted to know if you have like any actionable takeaways for people that are listening. We talked about supplements a little bit already, about like vitamin D, but I know stuff that is great for gut health is like pre and probiotics, L-glutamine, fermented foods. What other types of things could people be taking that are suffering from an autoimmune disease like RA or something that's affecting their central nervous system?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is decent literature on some other stuff. I think that the literature on turmeric is not bad. I don't want to say it's like, oh yeah, turmeric's going to cure you, but I think that there's very definitive literature that turmeric does have an anti-inflammatory effect. Really, the curcuminoids in turmeric. So if you can get a curcuminoid enriched formulation, that's probably better. I take turmeric pills to help me with my joints for beach volleyball.
I think taking turmeric pills again.
I can't tell if I feel a difference with them, but I kind of think I do. So I feel like it's not bad. And I actually end up cooking with turmeric a lot just because I like turmeric. I think it tastes good. And yeah, I think there's a decent amount of literature. I think there's other literature on collagen suggesting that it has some helpful effects in terms of joint health. But like we've talked about, whether or not this is going to really be your magic bullet, probably not. But is it worth trying? Probably, because they're pretty low risk aspects. But again, consult your physician if you're planning to do that, and just say, hey, I'm planning to do this. Is there anything really detrimental that you would think about this? And I think if they're like, it should be fine, try it, see if it helps, and go from there. And I think in terms of other actionable items, maybe from less of that perspective, I think journaling how you feel when you're doing various things is important, because we've talked about biology is so unique to many individuals that you can read these studies and say this study says 80% of people should feel better from this, and it's like, well, you need to do the effort and the research to see if you are in the 80% or if you are in the 20% kind of thing. And along with that, an actionable item that maybe isn't a day-to-day thing, but I think it's something that's important that people might not really think about, is really working on your ability to communicate with your physicians if you have an autoimmune disease or if you have any of these. Because like we've talked about, I think it's very easy as a physician who sees many people to say, this is what I see in general, and so this is what I'm going to prescribe. And not and I, in yours and Gabe's podcast episode, I think one of the things you guys talked about is there's a lot of good chiropractors and there's a lot of bad chiropractors, and a lot of good doctors and there's a lot of bad doctors. And that's very true. And so I think working to find someone who you can communicate well with is so essential, and not just saying, oh, like whatever. And also not being afraid of the doctor. The more you can communicate with them. I know in rheumatology and with rheumatoid arthritis, a huge issue is just that patients don't go to the
Mm,
doctor because it's a hassle, because they don't know what they have, because there's so many reasons that people don't go. I mean, I'm terrified of the dentist. I hate the dentist. But after I learned that, like, if I get periodontal disease, I'm more likely to get rheumatoid arthritis, I'm like, all right, I need to go to the dentist, kind of thing. So just really trying to develop a good relationship and treat your doctor as a person, and find a good doctor that you communicate well with, I think is something that but it's much easier to just say, I don't really like my doctor. I'm just not going to go and hope
yeah.
that, I'm going to continue to live my life. Um, I think that's an actionable item that is not really thought of maybe on a day-to-day basis, but is very important.
I love that because I think most people, if I'm generalizing or stereotyping, that have an incredible difficult time asking for help. And they don't want to
Yes.
ask help. And they're stubborn. They're like, I can figure this out on my own. I don't need anybody to help me. But like doctors are there. They're there to help you. They
Yes.
specialize in helping you be, as healthy as you can, or fixing things that are causing you problems.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that is unfortunate is that a lot of autoimmune diseases are, while doctors are there to help you, insurance unfortunately
Yeah,
is not
it
really.
fucks you.
And
Yeah, insurance
yeah.
sucks.
Yeah.
I this is kind of like, we've been talking a lot about Western medicine, and I'm curious. I have been having a lot of joint pain, and um, I think it has something to do with systemic inflammation because of my ulcerative colitis, and I'm also just
Yep.
more prone to inflammation because of my disease. One thing that really, really helps me is acupuncture, and I'm curious what the intersection between Eastern and Western medicine. In your experience, has there been a lot of studies on acupuncture and rheumatoid arthritis, or joint pain?
Yeah. So in terms of studies that I've read, I can't speak to a ton, but I think there are a lot of studies out there. I think one thing that is very unfortunate is I think there's a lot of distrust in science right now, but I don't think that's because of society. I think that's because of scientists. I think that's because
Mm,
we as scientists don't do a good enough job of communicating what we do. And I think also you can get into any field by just putting enough time in. And so I think there are studies out there that don't have the appropriate controls. And I just wanted to go on this tangent because I think sometimes what you'll find is you'll find studies on sort of non-traditional approaches where they're poorly controlled and they might show an effect, but they didn't appropriately have a comparison that would have actually shown whether or not that effect was due to the treatment or due to the fact that someone was just going in and doing right, like a placebo control is a lot of times what we call it, or something along those lines. Um, that said, so I think sometimes we're viewing literature on, and I think the more non-traditional you get, the less people want to study it, and the less people want to study it rigorously, especially in the West. And so sometimes I'm a little hesitant with those, and a little hesitant to suggest people go out and do their own research on it, because I think a lot of the times you can find something on the internet that says what you want it to say.
totally.
Always. But whether or not there is validity to it, yes, I do think that there likely is validity to those techniques. Like I was talking about the aspect of mechanobiology, and basically your cells have sensors of, oh, this they have sensors for stress and strain, not stress like, oh, I'm stressed, but stress like literally, like physical stress. And that's
Hmm.
one of the reasons that one of many reasons that working out is so good for you, and is actually very good for your bones and your joints. Literally the stress and the torsion on your bones stimulates them to grow stronger, whereas your muscles, it's a lot of nervous signals as well. But and so something like acupuncture, likely there is a therapeutic benefit because of aspects like that. In terms of my own experience researching it, I haven't done much research on it, um, but I think there is validity to some of that. But it's definitely, again, it's similar to what we talked about with supplements. You want to see if it works for you. You want to make sure that it's something that's not going to hurt you first,
Yeah.
I think.
Living in LA, I don't know if you experience or see this living down in San Diego, but there's a lot of like woo woo health things that people do gut health is like huge right now. That's all people are talking about. So like I live like a 2-minute walk from Erewhon. I don't know if you've heard of Erewhon, but it's like the most expensive. Okay, yeah, it's like
I've seen a couple like videos or stuff making fun of Erewhon. Just as
yeah.
like, oh yeah, only I spent $200 at Erewhon today, but I only go 6 days a week.
Yeah, it's you can like the canvas bags they sell is like $160, and it's literally just like a potato sack. It's ridiculous. But there's things like detoxes, CMOS, like a big company right now called Bloom Nutrition are claiming to do all these things to fix your gut health. So, well, one, I'd love to hear your take on detoxes because I have a strong opinion on things that label themselves as detoxes and people needing to do detoxes. But before I get into that, I would love to know your thoughts on these kind of like woo-woo detox like type things.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that it goes back to again with supplements. Like maybe some of them do have a little bit of validity to them, but again, if something doesn't if something is approved by the FDA, it's because it works in a large number of people and it has a significant effect in those people. If something is a supplement, it might work for something, but it also is completely, for the most part, unregulated. So it might not do anything, and it might be detrimental to your health. So I think it's just very good to be cautious of a lot of that stuff. And like you said, there's a lot of snake oil salesmen, and even in drugs, there's a lot of snake oil salesmen. Even in things that are I think this is where there's somewhat of a distrust of doctors. Is even in that there's like I think they're trying to crack down on this a lot more, but like 2 decades ago, there was a lot of like, as a pharmaceutical company, you could go to a doctor and say, hey, if you sell my drug,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you kickbacks. And like, or even if can't give you direct cash, like I can fly you out to our like business meeting that is our convention that's in the Bahamas for 5 weeks kind of thing. So I think they're trying to crack down on that, but there's a lot of snake oil everywhere, I think, and so just being cognizant of that. In terms of detoxes, all I can think about is this one time that one of my buddies in college was like, yeah, I'm doing like an iodine detox or something. I can't remember what it was, and it's like he was like only eating iodine pills for like for like a week or something, and for like the month afterwards, he's like, my joints hurt so much. I have no idea why. I'm like, well, I think I might know.
Yeah. Well, I think also people forget that, our spleen, our liver, other organs in our bodies are our detox centers. They're like what we use to filter out certain things. But there's like, this goes back to like the holistic lifestyle. A lot of these detoxes, people are not eating much. And one of the reasons they're feeling better is because they're probably not consuming foods or drinks that are causing inflammatory responses in their bodies. Like the stereotype of like the LA girly is like Friday night I go out raging and I drink a shit ton of stuff, but I have to go get my detox stuff the next day on Saturday to feel better. It's like you got to look at what is causing the inflammation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't drink much, mostly because in college I was running track and I was like the worst person on the team, and so I was just doing whatever I could to be better, and so I didn't drink, and I feel like that's sort of where you pick up the habit a little bit more. So I don't do that much, so that I think helps on that end. But I agree. I think you do have to look at what is causing the issue, and sure, if you're gonna go get this thing, it's I don't know, probably not really helping that much. Yeah.
Well, man, excuse my French, but this was fucking awesome. I learned so much. I can't wait to go back to listen to this. I'm probably going to have to listen to this multiple times just to digest everything that you told and educated us on. Is there anywhere, like, if people want to hear more from you or follow you, like, where people can find you?
No.
Or if you put out any studies or research that people can read?
So I do have a couple papers. I have one really big paper sort of that's on what I'm trying to spin out into a company currently. You asked how close it is to the clinic. Essentially, right now, we're doing what would be considered seed funding to try to get it through what are called pre-IND, which is basically an investigational new drug filing. And so there will be information on the company going up soon, but I feel like that's not something that's not like I want to go look at this thing. That's going to be more like we're putting that up for investors who are very serious biotech investors. The paper itself is out there, but it's very dense. I think there is a press release from UCSD that would probably be good, where I think if someone is more of a generalist, I try to give a little bit more of a background. So I can share that with you. And then one thing I would like to do, I mentioned, I think there's a lot of issue with scientific communication, in my opinion, right now. And I think that there's a lot of people in very niche fields who do important work but don't communicate the importance of that work. And so I am planning to try to start doing something like a podcast that's focused on communicating scientific.
Ooh, I love that.
Maybe not scientific findings, but also the general process of science and why you should trust science, or when you shouldn't, when you should ask questions and what types of questions you should ask. Because I think there's a lot of, I loved one statistic that I saw the other day that was like there were only 10 deaths in Teslas in like 2017, and there were like 100 deaths in Teslas in 2023, and I'm like, but how many more people are driving Teslas? Like, maybe that's an increase, but maybe it's not, because how many more Teslas are on the road? So,
well, you heard it here first. As soon as your podcast is up and running, we will advertise it all over ours.
Awesome. Likewise. I love what you're doing, and
Thanks, man.
Like you said, I think the holistic approach is so good, and I think that the way that you approach it is so comprehensive, but also like accessible.
I appreciate that, man. That means a lot. And I appreciate from the bottom of my heart you coming on. It's also great to catch up with you, man. I feel like I haven't talked to you since we graduated high school. It's been like 10 plus years. So it's wild. We will definitely have to stay in touch. Otherwise, you guys heard it. If you want to reach out and see the papers that he's written, I'll put the link. I'll grab it from him, the link in the description of this podcast. Otherwise, guys, enjoy this podcast. Save it so you can listen to it again, because there's a lot of good stuff in here. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later, Dave.
See ya.
All right, welcome to the fact check. This is a new portion. Dave, listened to the podcast before I released it, and I just gave him the opportunity to check in and see if there's any information that he wanted in addition to provide. So one of the first points that he wanted to point out was that, we were talking about detoxes and how silly they can be, but there is some validity to the fact that there are manufactured plastics that our bodies don't have the appropriate means to process. So, plastics aren't great for the environment in general. So another actionable item that you can do is to try to use glass, metal, or wood for food storage containers, utensils, water bottles, cookware, etc. Because there is a lot of evidence that there is a lot of microplastics that our bodies cannot process. Another point he wanted to talk about was around minute 36, where we're talking about the molecular mimicry theory on autoimmune diseases arising. He just wanted to note that this is currently just a theory that is being explored, and he's not really familiar with the specifics or research supporting it and various autoimmune diseases, but he wanted to note that it is a theory to be explored on how environmental factors like the microbiome can contribute to the rise of autoimmune disease. And around minute 39, he says there's a massive increase in penitate, and he mentions clinical trials. He actually went and found and reread the paper that he saw from 3 years ago, and he wanted to correct what he said. Essentially said that they noted that healthy patients have higher levels of penitate, which is a short-chain fatty acid, than patients with progressive MS. They had got 2 cohorts of MS patients and supplemented one cohort with penitate to give them normal levels relative to healthy patients and follow them for 2 years. And they found that the penitate helps show the MS progression and reduce the number of relapses per year. Help slow the MS progression and reduce the number of relapses per year. So it's not in clinical trials yet, but it helps demonstrate that supplementing short-chain fatty acids Supplementing short chain fatty acids, which is a byproduct of the microbiome, can be useful to improve outcomes in patients with altered microbiomes and autoimmune disease. And lastly, around minute 52, he just wanted to make sure that I pointed out there's a big difference between supplements and FDA-approved drugs. FDA-approved drugs are drugs that have been extensively tested for safety as well in specific indications. And I actually have an episode in season 1 about supplements because the supplement industry is highly unregulated. So this is a really good point that Dave makes, that there is a strong difference between supplements and FDA-approved drugs. But that's the fact check. There's also going to be resources in the description of this podcast that you can go check and research on your own. There's going to be an article about the pangiome. There's going to be an article referring to the bubonic plague and autoimmune diseases, which we talked about, and another one talking about tattoos and immunology. And that's the fact checked. Thanks again for listening, guys. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope I've inspired and motivated you. I hope your inner fat kid is more proud of you today than they were before this. Fitness is a journey everyone should start, but no one should finish. So whether you're continuing or starting yours, I am so glad that we get to be a part of each other's. With fitness, Noah.